So then, we are back with more understanding from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per Yirmiyahu the prophet. We find a layer of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we read then Yirmiyahu the prophet, we find then the structure of great portions of the holy instructions known as the Torah, and then obviously the spring feast and the autumn feast, the decisions of the government during his time, the restoration period, the 1,000 years of the Messiah. You find 1,000 years of the deceit, you find the end, you find even the post-autumn feast. So Daniel was then a prophet that was always obviously acquainted with the prophecies, mostly of Yirmiyahu the prophet, because at some point in his work he found himself then acknowledging that the 70 years of captivity was then ending, and was obviously a time for his people then returning and then rebuilding the holy site. Let's then evaluate what's going on with this world, and then the importance of understanding the nations as they are involved with the time of the restoration period. As the world then is mostly worldwide celebrating some sort of feast or celebration of sorts, let's make this extremely clear. When the documents were translated from the original manuscripts, unfortunately the Greco and the Romans, they didn't understand what went on with those documents. Let's then verify this Easter type of celebration of sorts. Truly, this celebration doesn't exist. But let's for a moment evaluate this from the perspective of facts, without questioning the faith or the sincerity or honesty related with it, but purely facts. The feast of Easter is obviously pagan. The practices of many years ago was involved with sacrificing babies born during 40 days of orgies, making a scandalous kind of celebration. Many people, for some reason, they link this absolutely bad type of practice with some sort of heavenly celebration, and there is no link with it. So let's then regard these a section of honesty and being truthful as far as people taking actions of celebrating then honesty and being truthful. But then let's study history, so then we don't find ourselves then involved with reminding practices of murder. That's what it was. During this time of orgies, they would have sex with prostitutes in the temple, and then the children, they were then born and sacrificed, and then eggs were then placed in the dam of children and then distributing around. That's where Easter and the practices thereof came from. So if you are a decent person, then you should study facts, so then you don't celebrate murdering children. It is absolutely scandalous. So paintings and these kinds of decorations, understandable. But maybe they can change a bit so then they don't practice murdering. They are reminding themselves then they are murderers. This is what they are. So then, is there any kind of a savior involved with Easter? Absolutely not. The holy feast is Pesach, and there is no link with Easter. Then, since this area is then cleared away, then people can change. They can, rather than giving those kinds of celebration gifts, they can give then a chocolate bar or something that doesn't remind themselves of this pagan, murderous, scandalous situation. So then, Daniel the prophet, obviously he was involved with years of work on behalf of the king. Though he was pagan, Daniel was doing a great job, and he was recognized as the most important trader of the time. This obviously is showing very true during this time of the restoration period, where you find then precision very important. Daniel was explaining a system of his own time, where then he was very acquainted with credit, many kinds of monetary systems, money exchange, then promissory notes, and so on and so forth. He was very acquainted with those kinds of financial systems. As the world developed and he saw then the understanding of the future, then he was obviously asking many questions, and then the future he was then understanding at the time of the end would be as Daniel's time, with the only distinction of velocity, transactions being made fastly. This was the only pertinent point of the time of the restoration period, and then the trade of the end. These truly is linked with other areas of precision. As far as the mysticism part of it, it should be secondary. Let's understand then what Daniel told his people via the prophecies, and what angel told Daniel to do. Even Daniel got a bit hot answers from the angel as far as a disciplinary type of answer. Daniel was asking questions, and the angel said, close up the understanding. It was an abrupt kind of not giving more answers. Daniel, at this point, when the angel told him, he should have been more concerned with his people then returning and making a path then for his people. Return to the Holy Land and then rebuilding the service. But he didn't. He was very consumed with the time of the restoration period, linked up with the Gentile type of a government. With this enlightenment, as far as the mysticism of revelation, we should be cautious likewise. The Messiah himself was very modest. He was not there in the midst of the situation, completing the spring feast, and the holy prophets of old, they were waiting for so long. There were then a particular prophet that saw the Messiah when he was a baby. And he was very pleased. And obviously, he thought of the situation as many prophets in the past wanted to observe the promise of Moses. There were decades and centuries they were training the holy feasts every year for the coming of the Messiah, and he did. So then, are we more interested in the Messiah and his coming and completing the spring feast, or do we want mysticism? We should ask ourselves, because the world is replete with mysticism, and it's precisely what then most of these religious people they teach. Sometimes having the holy knowledge is positive if we don't try to create a path for ourselves, so then placing ourselves on a pedestal. Should this be a role model in our lives? It depends. If the outcome of the understanding always lifts the Messiah in the path, then should be wise on doing it. If you have any other thoughts other than these, then is deviation from the path. So then, precision. Daniel the prophet was working under Darius the Mede, and he was very serious during his time of work and service for the kingdom of his time. And Daniel, obviously, he had a tradition of being extremely responsible, and the entire trade of the kingdom was obviously coming through his hands, and he was doing a great job. The more Daniel became older, the more the trade was then flourishing. And then there were no more questions for Daniel, because he was so known during his time, and he knew no other understanding could improve what he had learned. In our time, we're going to do precisely what Daniel was doing during his time. The only distinction is the transactions are then faster. In precision, you can't manipulate it. Let us try to understand. Though we are dealing with pagan world, pagan nations, and then they are becoming more acquainted of the fact of the Messiah and the holy cities. Precision is part of the Creator himself, being pagan or not. Now, when we have the understandings of the instructions, you find then sections of Revelation where then you can't manipulate precision. There are many kinds of images and understandings of Revelation where then you perceive in a certain way because of the translation. There is not an Hebrew translation from the original manuscripts of Revelation. You don't find it. What there is a translation from the Greco people, and they translated from manuscripts of the Hebrews, and they were destroyed. The manuscript generated at this time is not from the original. It's from the Greco translation. And let's be honest, when you translate an understanding involving a picture, oh dear, you have many kinds of interpretations. But a situation is certain. You can't manipulate or sit on precision. Some of these pictures, the understanding is the beast, but not dragons. You don't find dragons plural, you find dragon singular. And a beast with 7 heads like dragons and the such is fake. What you find is a beast with those kinds of understanding. Let's try to understand this factor. Daniel the prophet, he had the proper understandings of revelation as far as picturing. If not, then we are open to many kinds of interpretations. As far as revelation is concerned, it must be directly linked with Daniel. Yohanan saw what the prophets saw. You can't have discrepancies. Since we have the existing manuscript of Revelation known as Galah, from the Greco translation, and prior of the Greco translation was copied from an Hebrew translation, but then the interpreters of the Greco people, while reading the Hebraic manuscript, they didn't understand. What is the solution? Reading the prophets, reading Daniel, reading Yeshayahu, reading Yirmiyahu, reading Ezekiel, Zechariah. Then the layers of these is then projected then obviously on Revelation. So you won't ever find a woman then making a horse out of a dragon with the 7 heads. It doesn't make any sense. Think of yourself as a person reading Daniel and the significances of those beasts that Daniel saw. Then you find Galah. You have only a couple of situations. You have 1,000 years of the Messiah that was true, and 1,000 years of deceit. No holy cities of the Messiah. You find the facets of Nahashatan as then a facet of deceit, and then you find his facet of precision. Where do you link precision with Daniel? The system he was working with. You can't control or manipulate precision because of the fast computerized systems available at the disposal of each person. How are you going to sit on a system of a computer? So the portion of Daniel of the 10th chapter, 11th chapter, and the 12th chapter, these are related with Revelation in the time of the restoration period. Revelation is not only Galah of a separation of time, is a linking with times. sections of Revelation was during the time of the Messiah when he was completing the spring feast. The 7 seals of the Megillah was opened many years ago. So the main problem is, firstly, ignorance, and then mysticism. You mix then mysticism with ignorance, then you have the control of the people. They can swear by heaven or any other situation because they are being truthful. It's not they are being truthful, they are only being honest. Being truthful and being honest, they are not the same. You can have a bit of knowledge from an era where then, while you are honest, you are not truthful. Does that make you a scoundrel? No, if you don't make the proper adjustment, then it does. Later on, then, you must evaluate then these pictures of Galah, but you can be sure of it. A lot of it is simply wrong translation from the original manuscript. They were translated from people without knowledge. As we understand, back then the persecution was fierce, and people handling documents of the Hebrews were then put to death. This is how fierce it was then, persecution. So while they were translating it to get rid of it, they translated in a certain way they didn't understand. When you find it, should you be then considered a scoundrel? No. Gives an incentive to study further. But you can be sure of this point. Linking up Daniel and the precision thereof of his work in our time, then in a fasterly pace, gives you the understanding of precision. In this world of Gentile, Nahashatan for some reason has chosen dragon. It is his facet of precision. There is no longer deceit as far as we understand from 1,000 years of deceit because it has expired. Then later we understand that his facet then changes again. He will become again the destroyer. So there is a transition of spirit and a transition of this age, as we then changed from deceit, then to precision, then precision to destroyer. Speaking of the combat of the end. But the point is, we have shortly got rid of a huge portion of Revelation, only speaking simple situations of Daniel. So then, as we rescue then the original manuscripts, as far as reading the prophets, then we simply update what we already know, and then we push forward for more of these understandings. So let's hope many people they will to change the existing kind of celebration and maybe give a chocolate bar. This is for you then to eat after lunch. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.